What's good, good people? Welcome to hashtag My Be More Project. What's the 410? Where we stand in the gap of the news you can use and the positive stories our spirits need. I'm your host, Dion Joyner Weems. It's like a tribe called Quest. You got to say it all together. And though I wear many hats, they all sit on top of the same mission to uplift, amplify, and empower the truth tellers and the change makers on the ground. Whether that's through hashtag My Be More Project, my book, That Part What Some Know But Won't Tell You About Motherhood, or as the Chief Energy Officer of Audacity Group, a global marketing shop where we tell bold stories. We've learned, just as you've probably realized in 2022, that people trust people more than they do systems. And that's why we have today's show where we center the voices on the ground doing the work, like Maurissa Stone, visionary of the Living Well, healer, equity strategist, and community cultivator. Let's bring her up, shall we?
Good morning, good people. Good day, good evening, good afternoon. Yes.
Maurissa, let me tell you, it's always an honor to be in your company. And before we jump into the questions, I wanted to give your bio, but we also look at it as our verbal flowers, okay? And I want to make sure that I pronounce it Iona Concepts. Is that how I pronounce it?
Yes, Iona.
It rolls because Iona
Yes.
Concept. Okay. Maurissa Stone is the founder of the Living Well, a Baltimore hub for health, healing, and community connection. Through her consulting firm, Iona Concepts, she brings decades of experience in equity and organizational change to build spaces where people and ideas thrive. At the Living Well, she has created programs like the Living Library Human Story Exchange, amplifying real stories as a form of collective healing. Her advocacy extends to cannabis policy and reparations, ensuring communities most impacted by the war on drugs gain access to the opportunities and justice they deserve. Maurissa work bridges policy, wellness, and community organizing, making her a true cultivator of both healing and change. Would that be fair, Maurissa?
Oh my goodness, when you hear it out loud, it's like, really? But the part about decades and decades, I was like, but it's true. Like, I started in this work very young. And so I feel honored to be able to, bring all of those experiences and opportunities to this platform.
You do that and you do it so well, Maurissa. And and real talk, when we talk about these decades of experience, it's to recognize when real recognize real. You're not walking into any room light. You bring a heavy load of experience. Now, before we jump into the interview, we like to do this thing called They Ate, right? Where we ask you 8 rapid fire questions. Don't overthink it. Just say what comes to your mind. Are you ready?
Okay.
Crab cake, fried or broiled?
Fried. Broiled. I'm sorry. Broiled.
Broiled. Nickname your parents used to call you?
My family name is Tita. It's spelled Tita, but my family here in Baltimore, they don't say Tita, they say Tita.
Tita. Tita. Ooh, Baltimore, I love us. Name one song on your Get Pumped, Amped, Fired Up playlist. What you putting on when you need to get,
Living the Light by Fertile Ground.
That is beautiful. And shout out to Fertile Ground.
Yes.
A scent that brings you peace. A smell, a scent that brings you peace.
I love ambers. I love vanilla. I love lavender. Yeah.
Beautiful. I felt peaceful just hearing that repeated, which is interesting. Would you survive a zombie apocalypse?
Probably, yeah.
One word for Baltimore. Give me one word that you would use to describe Baltimore.
Love.
A word your friends use to describe you.
Tenacious.
I agree. If you had 25 hours in a day, what would you do with that extra hour?
Chill.
People, I think she just ate. I think we can all agree that Maurissa Stone, she came with the answers and she is done. On that note, let's jump right in. Let's talk about the living well. Like we talked about healing, creating, connecting spaces, but before the vision became, the brick and mortar where you're walking into the place, what was the lived experience that first told you, Maurissa, our community needs a place like this?
Mhm. It was working as a management consultant for a national funder in community development, where I helped to discern who was going to get this money. It started with working at the University of Maryland on the administrative side of the house. Um, as the director of faculty and staff training for University Human Resources, that said, listen, these oppressive policies are baked in to the practices and the policies at this institution. And so I just kind of, felt like, we in Baltimore, we use this term, the nonprofit industrial complex.
Yeah.
And I was living that, like I was living it to survive, if you will, really contributing to that system. And also, quite honestly, oftentimes contributing to the myth of white supremacy as an act of survival. I always say, my background is organizational development.
Okay.
That's my bread and butter, if you will. And I always say that, when you are operating, especially in, these corporate environments or nonprofit environments, your ability to thrive has less to do with your skills, knowledge, and abilities, and more to do with your ability to identify and to negotiate the culture. And if
Mm.
you are a person of color, your ability to identify and to negotiate racism.
Marissa, you live this world for the everyday person who, after a while, like nonprofit industrial complex, it becomes such a term, but no one knows what it means. Like, what
Mhm,
what does that mean to
mhm.
the everyday person when you say that?
Right. So, we tend to have been culturalized, if you will, that nonprofits are in the business of helping, right?
Right?
That, this is about servant leadership,
Yeah.
but also it's a system. So when I worked as a funder, we had a threshold criteria for entities to be able to even talk to us about
Mm.
the money, right? And so, a threshold criteria is going to be, a strategic plan. Well, a lot of mission organization or smaller mission organization, they can't afford somebody like myself and my company to come in and provide strategic planning, right?
Right.
Um, 3 years worth of unqualified audits. Really? So many of us mission organizations or impact organizations, we're not at a place where we're doing third party audits, right?
Okay.
And also, understanding that, we want boards that represent the communities that we serve.
Correct.
And
Correct.
so sometimes and oftentimes organizations go out and, they pull people from the community to sit on their boards, right? But they're sitting there, they don't necessarily have voice or power
That's
in
good.
those communities. The nonprofit model, as we know it, we're seeing that it's starting to outlive its utility. I say this over and over and over again. The future organization will operate as open teams of teams with a
Mm.
symbiotic relationship working towards a common mission and purpose, right? And so
Right.
the nonprofit industrial complex, is a system, that is, in its front, the nonprofits, were really created to, shield wealthy money, right?
Oh.
Write-offs. So, but also, what we're seeing now and during this Trump administration, and what we saw back in the Reagan administration, that they started devolving social government programs and sending those programs to the states. And so, what the states did, the states was like, okay, you nonprofits, you're going to have to compete against
Mhm.
these penitents, right? And so we are inserting, European ethos of rugged individualism and competitiveness. In this space, we don't have room for competitiveness.
We don't
We
have.
get caught up in this needs to be my name and it needs to be our organization that's flying this flag. But the truth of the matter is, first of all, Maryland doesn't need another nonprofit. It's the last thing
I
that
agree.
Maryland needs.
I
And
agree.
also, a nonprofit is a tax structure, right? It's a tax structure, more so than anything. And so, what we have to understand now as nonprofits in this arena is that we are competing against those huge organizations. Let's give as Under Armour an example.
Mhm,
Under
mhm.
Armour has a profit line of business and a nonprofit line of business, right? And
Right.
so also you have today where the Living Well is not a nonprofit, it is a profit entity with a social mission. And so we have a fiscal agent. So, those of you guys that don't know, you can align yourself, you can join a fiscal agency. So, we had a fiscal agency here in Baltimore called Fusion that carried a lot of social impact organizations, Black led, and they folded, right? And so you can, at this time, get a fiscal agency to do your work. So I say that to say that you also have to understand that organizations, let's say here in the Baltimore area, are actually competing with Under Armour, who has a social mission. So if you are
A minute.
going
That
after
don't make sense.
you
Why
are
you
going after grant dollars, right? um, a profit entity with a social mission can also go after those same grant dollars. So what I'm trying to get to is that not only are we competing against one another, right? Because we were taught that in this environment when I said when the Reagan administration started devolving social programs, right? So we're
right.
seeing that again, the devolution of federal social programs. So, how do we get things done? We have got to work together and we've got to figure out who has strength and capacity in what areas and figure out where those strengths and capacity can sit to support the engine of these entities that are doing social impact work. So, to that point, the Living Well, we use a platform model, right?
Mhm.
So we are a open systems,
Open
right?
system.
So we are a canopy, if you will,
Okay.
but our brain trust are people who we know in the community. We
Got
know and trust them, right? And
right.
so when we need some capacity or thought leadership on a specific area, we reach out to our brain trust. Now, how is a brain trust different than a traditional board? Well, our brain trust is not passive, right?
Mhm,
So this past weekend, I guess we'll talk about, we just had our third Black Canny as our, it's a cannabis conference or convening.
mhm.
Um, and the thought leadership that put that together comes from the brain trust.
Got it.
To be able to staff that, if you will, comes from the brain trust, right? So that we're not looking so much outward, begging people to get on their platform and for money, right? We
Yep.
are working collectively. Um, so
Let me ask you, and one, I was about to interrupt you when you asked yourself a question. I'm like, look at Maurissa literally taking my job. Um, but it's the fact of you can tell that you always see the point of connections. When I speak to you, you're talking about policy, you're talking about equity, you're talking about healing. Can you give more examples, Maurissa, of how you found the way through your work to bring a connection of those three? Just like you said with the event that you've had of leveraging the brain trust, how have you those three worlds collided and helped to change the direction of something? Can you give more examples of how your method of bringing folks together has actually changed the direction of
Mhm.
something?
Well, so can we talk about, we just launched the Living
Please,
Library Human Story
please,
Exchange.
yes, yes, yes.
So, I have like these, amazing folks. I could, just start dropping names that the Baltimore community would know that, just didn't come to the Living Well. They've been rocking with the Living Well, for years and years. And so this year would be our 16th, 17th year, I think, in operation, right? In a formal operational
Congratulations.
way. And so, we created the Living Library because, people often come to us and, they'll say, Maurissa, I would love for you to mentor me. We have nonprofits and small organizations that are, in their infantile stage that, want OD work and they can't afford, what a corporation is going to pay, right? And
Right,
so on our brain trust, we have healers, we have thought leaders, and we also have artists. And so there are three segments. And let me just say this, you did a report some years ago, or maybe a couple of years ago, that I read. And one of the things that you said in this report was that, we really needed a cachet of artists, healers, and thought leaders to inform the work in our communities, right? And when I read that, I was working on a report called The Anatomy of Blight. I work with a company that you
right,
may
like
know,
one. Yep.
Blight Baltimore. I'm the chief equity strategist, if you will. Nika Namdi, who also is the co-founder of the Stop Oppressive Seizures Fund, is on our brain trust.
Big shout
And
out.
right. And so, we think about you know, like all of these folks that people want access to, but don't really know how, they don't necessarily have the money. And also the questions that people really want to ask, but, are kind of like out the realm of the professional, landscape is like, where did you grow up? Like, what was the painful problem that got you here? Like, what made you interested in blight, right? What made you interested in, looking at racial justice? And, how did you get to be a yoga instructor? And, you know what I mean? Like, how did you start drumming? Like, these are questions that, are not necessarily the professional questions, right?
Agreed.
But
Yeah,
these kind of make up the characters
correct,
of people who are doing the work, right?
correct,
And
correct.
so we launched our Human Story Exchange a couple of weeks ago with Micah, with Unique's program over at their community arts leadership program. And so we had our Brain Trust member, Tracy Jiggets, who is an artist, Milani Douglas,
Come
uh,
on.
Dominic Nell, and Chango Ayango
Come
to
on.
go and talk to these community fellows. We're actually getting ready to do something with Baltimore's Promise, Baltimore Youth Data Hub, to kind of
Mhm.
talk about positionality and the research process of doing community participatory research, right? And so, like, how are we moving this needle? It is with people and people that are on the ground, right?
Correct,
And it's
correct.
organizing, in its infantile stage. We also have a breaking free men's mental health program for Black men in healing. And so, when we created this program, in my head, it wasn't just about, healing the brothers, because sometimes the brothers are with sisters and the brothers are not mentally well. And sisters, we oftentimes, protect our brothers and we're protecting ourselves in a way that, we stay in situations that are not healthy for us and for our children, etc. So, breaking free is a way that we are trying to move the needle in terms of mental health for men and providing safe space for men to talk about the impact and the collateral damage of racism and how they experience racism in everyday life and their jobs and just,
Yes,
going
yes,
to and from the relationships or lack thereof with their
yes,
family.
yes.
There's a lot of trauma in our communities, right? And we don't necessarily name it as trauma,
Right,
but we also think and feel and believe and try to demonstrate that, there are existing what we call healing technologies,
right. Oh, yes,
that
yes,
we
yes.
have access to,
Right,
right? That we
right.
just need to provide a pathway to that access.
To that point, one, and I hope as people are listening to you that they lock into what I always feel when I'm in your company. You have a way of saying the quiet parts out loud, or the parts that, you know, people may feel a sense of shame, which is a plot, right? If I keep you in shame, then I'm going to keep you in silence and I won't communicate. Maurissa, you've always had this gift of bringing that out. It's the healing tools. I also, this may be looked as a pivot, but the way you've even combated cannabis through healing and reparations. Like I'd like for you to talk more
Mhm.
about the justice and the healing technology, how those two come together. How, Maurissa, how have you
Yes,
brought this
thank
to
you
your
for that. Thank you for this opportunity. Um, just this past weekend, we did the Black Candy. This is our third conference convening. I put the Black Candy together, if you will, with the help of, our brain trust once again. In 2023, when Maryland legislated an adult use cannabis market, I was thinking to myself, there's just no education that they're putting out around this. This is not your back in the day weed. This is not scary dude on the corner. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry that blacks represent less than 4%. And
mm,
that number, from what I understand, just from the other week, has gone down. Right. And so, I was just thinking about who was most impacted by the war on drugs. Who? Black and brown folks were most impacted by the war on drugs, right? And
mm-hmm.
so, like, how do we, first of all, address the hypocrisy of, you got people still sitting in jail
Mm-hmm.
for cannabis? I'm not talking about cannabis related convictions that are attached to other violent forms of conviction. No, no. I'm talking about people who are sitting in jail, right, with cannabis convictions, right? And so when you talk about policy and how you wrap this together, first of all, we've got to advocate for our freedoms and our rights, right? This is, you know, we have to understand the history of cannabis. Cannabis, I hear these little terms like, cannabis is an alternative medicine. It was actually the original medicine. Let's just, you know what I mean? Like, it was the original medicine. And now, like, we, have, been, this process of prohibition was, really steeped in racism, right? That, our country had somebody at the, top of this department that is no longer, and decided that we were going to create this iconography about the war on drugs, and that cannabis was a gateway
Mm-hmm.
into, heroin or
Yep, yep,
cocaine or
yep,
whatever,
cocaine,
right? Well, we
yep,
know that trauma is the gateway drug. However, let's just go back. So we were kind of taught to look at cannabis, as this very scary thing. We did the DARE program and all of the things. And
yeah,
now we got cannabis dispensaries on every other corner. You go to New York City and
right,
some of the other places. So when you start talking about the intersection of policy, right? When I
right.
worked at the University of Maryland, I started seeing policies that if you are non-exempt, um, you can't go to training. What? What kind of
Mm,
position
mm,
apartheid is this, right?
mm,
I
mm.
learned that, blue collar workers that worked in FM didn't have access to training. And I went to the higher ups and I was like, why, what is this about? And, that director at the time, felt like if somebody was cutting grass, they didn't need, training. Like, what is he going to be riding training on? And I was like, at least, some computer technology, because
Yeah.
when
Yes.
I go to get my pay stub, I gotta log on. So like how these people knowing that you're not beating them out their money. Right. And so this is when you start intersecting, just kind of seeing what the policies and practices and how they're baked in, not only to organizations, but our communities. So, when we started doing the community participatory research for writing the anatomy of blight, we started, kind of digging into the relationship with the Department of Public Works and the Department of Housing, and how those relationships were very punitive, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so you start unpacking practices and look back how they're attached to policies.
Got you. Got
So,
you.
so at the Living Well, and let me just say, I need to say this to folks
Yes,
too.
please. Yes.
I actually bought the Living Well from a sister we know and love in community, and Elijah Brown. She had this little yoga space on Charles Street that I used to do a lot of retreats. I've been doing women's retreats for years and years. And she was at a point in her life where she didn't have capacity, and she was like, "Why don't you just take it? And you don't have to be called the Living Well." And I was like, "No, I like the name. We're going to stick with the name. The name already has a footprint. I don't want to have to like start
Right.
over."
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about our rubric of soulful expression, conscious expansion, optimal wellness, so everything we do, we make sure that it's driven by those three value systems, because our
Got you.
values drive our behavior. So I hope I answered your question in a
Phenomenal.
okay.
And I've got more. Not only have you answered the questions well, I want you to help educate me, because I've heard you use the term, and you said the plug built the cannabis economy but remains locked out of opportunity. How do you reimagine equity so those who sustain the culture are not erased from the industry? So one, I wanted to understand plug. Like, what do you mean by that? Can you school me? Teach me, teach
Right.
me, teach me.
Right. So in cannabis culture, the person who we're getting our plant medicine from is referred to as the plug,
The plug.
right?
Gotcha.
The plug.
Gotcha.
And I also want to say, too, just I want to, bring this up because this weekend we honored the plug. We honored the plug. Actually, we honored a brother that many of you guys in the community may know. Remember Matthew Rice, aka Mateo Blue. Mateo
Yeah, yeah.
was a plant
Artist. Yes.
medicine activist, right? He died, I think, in 2023. He succumbed to his, I think, ailment of brain cancer. But he was a brother in community. He was an artist. We loved him. And he also, taught us a lot about the healing properties of cannabis. So that being said, I wanted to honor the plug because the plug, during prohibition, at their own safety, and risk of freedom, delivered plant medicine to the community. And when we think about the plug, oftentimes, again, we think about scary dude on the corner,
Yeah.
but we also have women who are the plugs. And then also we have to think about what we call in our cannabis industry the legacy operator. Okay. So the people who were selling or distributing and or growing. So we don't think about the
You're right.
legacy operator being the botanist,
You're right.
who was growing cannabis, right? We don't think about them. And so in terms of honoring the legacy operator, the plug, honoring their work and also recognizing, to what you said, that they set up this regulatory market. They set up the framework for the market, right? But we don't talk about that. We just think that
You're
out the
right.
clear blue sky that you can walk into a dispensary. No,
Nope.
no, right? The plug is the people who set that up and really could inform this market. So this weekend, past weekend, we had Tabitha Johnson from the Maryland Cannabis Association. We had Rashawn Peak, I can't think of Rashawn's last name, from Office of Social Equity come and talk about the roles of the state. But also we had those plugs that transitioned into the regulatory and ancillary cannabis market. So when I say regulatory, I mean that have a license, right? And
Right,
those
right,
who have
right.
created businesses in the ancillary market, which is a lot of opportunity. Cannabis in the regulatory market is still at its infantile stages. Now, the other thing I think is important for me to say while I have this airtime is that cannabis is not legal. It is regulated. It's still federally illegal. So when you talk about policies, you've got, like I always say, that if you are in the cannabis culture, if you're consuming cannabis in any ways, and we have different forms of
Right,
consuming for
right.
the plant process of it, but I mean the healing process from it. But if you are in this business, you also should be an advocate. You should be an advocate. You should understand what's going on the federal level as well as on the local level. So it's important to understand if you are a consumer of cannabis and you are living in public housing, you are at the risk of losing your housing.
You're right.
If you're coming to town for treatment at Hopkins or wherever, for your condition that you are using this plant medicine to manage, then you cannot strike up a nothing in a hotel.
Mm-mm.
And then also by law, you can't smoke it on the street. So Maryland doesn't necessarily have opportunity for, at this point, for consumption lounges, right? For people to have safe space. And so
Oh,
a part
mm.
of our canny, our second day of our canny, was to provide access to, what we call ceremonial practices, traditional healing practices of cannabis, where we had a space where we were able to
Wow.
um, enjoy, if you will, the plant. And so we did some rituals. And so our work at the Living Well is not only around thought leadership and art and music, but it's also about what we know as cultural sustainability, right? Like, how do we sustain, our culture and our art forms, right? Absent the gaze of white supremacy.
Absent the gaze. Absent the gaze. It's as you were talking, I pray that it's not distracting. Like I'm writing the questions as they come, because I like this exercise of taking the words that we've heard but giving context based off of the experience. So harm reduction. Harm
Yes,
reduction is a phrase that gets used in policy circles a lot. But for the people you serve, it's a lived reality. So, what does harm reduction look like when it's personal and not just, program programmatic? When it's,
right.
what does that
So
look like?
thank you. Thank you for that, because in the swag bags that we gave out this weekend, we had Narcan and we had fentanyl test
Uh,
strips, right? And
right.
so it's important for us to make sure that we are doing the work and also educating our consumers at the same time. So Brother Juan Nance brought a group of folks that he was working with that were from out of town to the candy on Saturday. And a sister came up to me and she said, "My goodness, you are doing harm reduction," because she opened up her swag bag and
Yeah.
saw her Narcan. So I am in my consultancy, Iona Concepts. We've been doing some harm reduction work and studies in the city of Elizabeth, New Jersey, right?
Mm,
And that we've got to understand that harm reduction starts with families. It starts with grace in our community, and to understand that we can get into this bag, if you will, that I'm not trying. We're not. The cannabis community is not necessarily related to the opioid community, but um, it's important to know that
mm,
cannabis also can be used for harm, right?
Understood.
Um, we found out last year that, people who were buying street weed, and I got into, some folks like disagreed with me. They were like, I did a little campaign through the Black Candy, don't buy street weed. Well, oftentimes street weed is dispensary weed, but at the same time, street weed could be dangerous,
You're
right?
right.
So we had some street weed that was laced with fentanyl. And
Mhm.
so even though, us in the cannabis community that are in it for, more of the healing properties, right? I have a child with an autoimmune condition, and that I know that she uses cannabis as a
Mhm.
healing tool, right? To
Understood.
make her feel better. Like everybody is not, using cannabis for its THC, you
Correct.
know, they're not. And so we just need to be educated about this, right? And our politicians who are making these laws need to be educated
Understood.
about, what this is. And we don't necessarily have a pathway for the regular person. I want to say to you that baby boomers are probably, in terms of stats, like we're not looking at hard numbers, but are probably the highest consumer population of cannabis.
Mm.
One is that we have experience with it, right? And also we are seeing the ailments that cannabis supports. And
Right.
so that we're not taking a lot of, synthetic pharmaceutical medicine, that we have, I hate to use the words alternative, but we have an alternative way. And not all cannabis products have activated THC,
Correct.
right?
Right.
We hear a lot about CBD, but we, at the Black Candy, our goal is to provide safe space for folks in our community that have experienced a lot of trauma around cannabis, because you would be sent to jail, and that impacts your community. 2 Mondays ago, we partnered with Black Cannabis Week and DACO, and we did a circle of what does reparations look like in cannabis? Because we have this reparations council here, right?
Do.
We
Yeah.
know that a percentage of the cannabis
Right.
tax sale money is supposed to go to those communities that are most harmed by the war on drugs. And so,
Mhm.
we did have Dr. Ray Wimbush, who was on that council, Dr. Kalila Harris. We had Lawrence Grand Prix there, who, the LBS helped to write that
You see
policy
fit. Yes. Yep.
around, social equity. And then there's topics that come up out of that, like what's the difference between social equity and social reciprocity as it relates to cannabis? Okay. Also, is those social equity programs really serving, community? Because I don't know if folks know this, but in Maryland they did a lottery for people who had to be able to identify themselves as living in a community that was most impacted by the war on drugs, right? So that you could be qualified as social equity eligible. And so from there, you got to join a lottery. So you could put up 5,000 for a full license or 1,000 for a micro license. And the areas were dispensary, right? So you know what a dispensary is. A
Mhm.
cultivator, that means a grow facility, and a
Mhm.
processor. So the processors are the people who are processing the cannabis, testing the cannabis, and that's where you're getting like the gummies from. So
Mhm.
you had those three areas. And so it was a lottery. So you put your money in, plus also please know to write these applications, you really need to get a professional to help you, because
Oh my
average
God. Yes.
Joe does not know how to write a business plan for a cannabis business. Okay. And also, you also had to have a retail location. So you put your name in, you send your money in, your application, and if you did not win, if you crapped out, they kept your money.
Are
So
you
you're
kidding
already
me?
talking about people who have been impacted by the war on drugs. We've already established that economically that we're probably
The leaves
uh,
behind. It's
yes,
a
we have
setup.
some disparities there. And so I say this to say that, it really like hit me, like those people, they still want access into
Yeah. Yeah.
ancillary or regulatory market. And so the Black Canny is designed to provide safe space and conversations and opportunities. And so we've got, folks from the cannabis industry in those circles. We've got people who want to be. We've got people who were, past had past convictions, if you will. And we have the people, who are growing and the people who are using for different ailments. And so, we have all of those people in these circles, in these rooms, so that we can, continue helping to build their dreams and their pathways, even though, that process was extractive. And so
Man,
many times in our communities, for us to get in, we have to be exposed to these extractive processes. Um, and then also, people need to know the reality about what that actually means. And so, people will tell you that they've lost millions of dollars. This is not
I
an
can
easy
imagine.
industry. You have to be in the cannabis industry for the love of it, right? Just like
Wow.
any social impact work that you're doing, you're not doing it, if those of us who are in this work,
You're
we're not
right.
necessarily doing it for the namesake. This is not the living well, does not pay Maurissa Stone's bills, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Um,
Yes,
you know what
ma'am.
I'm saying? So you have to do this for your love. For me, it's for my love for my people. And also, like, what can I do to move the needle, what you're talking about? And, how can we imagine different forms of what we know as Black social uplift, right? Or
Right.
mutual aid. And so, this year or next year, I said I was going to write about the model that I visioned, that I've been
Good.
tweaking in
Good.
terms of this work. But I needed like a decade to kind of figure it out, right?
Yes. Okay.
What this
Yes.
is, because a lot of times when I started in 2009, there wasn't a lot of language around this, right?
That's yes.
I started talking to people about social capital, and they were
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
"What?" And so now, it's language in our lexicon. I want the language in our lexicon to understand what social open systems are. Open systems is that your team, come on, your team, come on, come on. We're going to talk about this. We're going to get it done. And we're going to provide support to one another and making that happen. And it's also, too, about bringing folks in so that they can collect whatever that is that they need to collect to go back out and populate that into community, right? Is
Marissa. Pause for one moment. Pause for one moment. The reason that this platform was created because cities like Baltimore, major urban cities like Baltimore, are constantly talking about how do we authentically attack the challenges that we have. And the way to do that is to bring the people with the most lived experience to the table. And from my gaze, I have not seen those folks that I've met in the community at those tables. So, Marissa, having you here is one, I'm proud to be able to say, like, look, for anyone who has questions, challenges, concerns, you're looking for an advocate, a voice of insight, of reflection built on lived experience, sitting right here is Maurissa Stone. And then to step back, and I wrote down this question back to the earlier joke, but the truth is there. Your career spans at least 3 decades across nonprofit, government, and grassroots work. And looking back, there is a thread. It has to be a thread for you that ties through all of them. I want you to talk about what the thread is, but I want to state from my end when you talk about loving the work, because Marissa's not out here rolling around in a Rolls Royce going off to, the Keys on the weekend, though she deserves to be able to. Just because you love the work does not mean that you don't deserve the riches that come from the blessings that you are to others. But I want people to see you and to support your work, and then to also bring you in, because you make it easy, Maurissa. Like you know your shit, Maurissa. Like you are just
Well, I
you
get in
know.
trouble a lot. Like I do because there are certain people who, when you see injustice and you see disparities, some of us are very comfortable to sitting around like, hey, I'm worrying about my coins. I'm not,
Right.
I ain't getting involved. But some of us, are like, oh no, I'm going to stand up. I am. And so the thread for me, I founded Iona Concepts, which is Iona is a name that enslaved mothers gave their daughters around agency. I own her, my owner, my own, right? And so this is, about agency. And so that's the thread, back in the day when I started my consultancy, it was really about like, how do you help people to uplift their individual and collective agency,
Good.
right?
That's
So, that's the thread. When I worked, in the university systems, um, it was agency, whether I was teaching, whether I was doing research and training, et cetera. It was like, how do you support one's agency? In this work around healing is all about agency. It's about being able to, you know, heal some of those things that we're not able to talk about, right? In
mm,
our career paths, in our building businesses, we have to have agency to do that. We have to have personal agency. When you were building my Baltimore, when you were building Audacity, you had to have agency to do that. You can't build shit without agency,
that's
right?
good.
And our work entities try to teach us how to not have agency, right? We're not innovating because innovation is scary. I'm the director of innovation at the Living Well. Like that's my role, is to look at opportunities to innovate. And Nika Namdi always says that innovation must make room for failure. And so you got to be willing to fail. You also, in this work, you've got to be comfortable with not being liked, right? You've got to be comfortable because sometimes you got to be the one to say, no, no, we're not doing that. I'm sorry. I'm not new to this work. I'm true to it. So when you're
Ooh,
talking about racial justice, social justice, cannabis justice, healing, it all starts with, first organizing, right? Organizing around the policies and the practices and be able to look at that from a data perspective. We say at Fight Blight that we are informed by the village and led by the data, right?
come on.
Um, and
Mm-hmm.
so you got to be able to understand the village. And also, and I'm going to say this, we also, as, people, Black people, African people, we got to check in how we wear our stripes of white supremacy. Like, how are we showing up in this work? Because this
Understood.
work is not easy. You have to have grace too. You have to be comfortable with candor and conflict. The living well brain trust, let me tell you, me, Jason, be fighting all the time, but listen, that brother is brilliant. And my point is that you got to be willing to be chin checked. Chango Oyango now, like we all like, I be like, oh my God, like we go for it. But at the end of the day, they'll brick my head and I'm on the ground bleeding out. And they be like, what we doing? What we doing? We going to get something to eat, we smoking, what we doing? Like ain't nobody caring about your little feelings being hurt because this work is not about your ego. It is about the work. And so I will say that
How
in
can you
terms of
in us winding down, Dion has a question and an alley oop. Okay, so what's the question, Dion? I've been taking so many notes. I feel like I'm in school. I'm just like writing. What did you want? This is more personal because I know that you hold the space for healers and artists and activists. So when you step out, and we've had personal conversations, so I
mhm,
you know that I've lost my father, right? In
mhm,
the last 7 months, I've lost my father, and you have been such a
mhm,
comforter with this grief. with this grief walk, right? So this question kind of falls in line with that. And knowing that you hold the space for healers and artists and activists, when you step out of facilitator mode, where do you go in Baltimore, or where do you go in space to restore yourself?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the question. But the alley oop is, how do we support people who are watching, support your work so that you're not killing yourself? So take that.
Well, where do I go? I have a little hubby hole in Hampton, Virginia, that I can, escape to. But let me tell you, I have spaces in Baltimore where I go to work and chill. That there's places where I go when I want to be in community and see folks that I know and to chat with. And, I have my little favorite coffee shops. And I think everybody should get their little, coffee shop or space, whether it be like Patterson Park or Drewdale Park. You've got to find that space for yourself, right? And how to support is, don't make assumptions that we got all our shit together. As I said, if you want to get involved in movement work, go to the people who are in the movements. Collectively is a great source and resources for, Black-led social justice entrepreneurs that are doing the work. Go on their site, look at those folks who, join the collective give, and, figure out, like, you don't necessarily have to give money. You could, you are a good social media person or a photographer, or you write grants, or you do any damn thing, right?
Understood.
Because we are in this point in time where, cobbler's got to cob, painter's got to paint, right? And those of us who are doing these key roles, that's how you support. I just want to say too, that I'm more than excited, just grateful and honored that I will be joining the second cohort of the collectively Doctors Elmer and Joanne Martin Social Impact Fellowship. And
Wow,
so,
congratulations.
yes,
Maurissa, perfect.
who I'm sitting in space with, I mean, everybody on there, I'm just tingling because everybody on there is like, I know of their work or know them, and, have history of building
Yes,
with
yes,
them. So
yes.
I am more than excited, but I just say to the audience here, it may look like we doing this and it's all good, but trust and believe, this is a grind, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, financially, physically, you name it. It is taxing. I've got to think about what succession looks like for the living well, right? And for this work and this body of work, because
Understood.
I'm at a station of life where
Understood.
I want to travel and do some things that I can
Yes,
write about, if you will. And so I just give honor to you, Dion, because I've watched you for years, and we have always intersected in ways in terms of people, but having these platforms to be able to amplify folks like myself. Somebody at the Canny said, why aren't major news stations here?
I
I said,
know.
because we keep depending on these large scale outlets that not necessarily have us in their best interest. So I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to your team on What's the 410 for having me and my Be More project. And I would really love an opportunity for us to make those creative collisions more
Absolutely.
in the near future.
I'm already looking at the library, the living library. I'm like, you speak the language. It's our story, right? Until the lion learns to speak, every story will always glorify the hunter. You are the voice of the lions. I am the voice of the lions. The people that are on the ground doing this work, you are the voice of the lions, not taking anything away from the local or national media. I know of partners there who do have a heart for it, but we also know that stories shape policies. So when you already have a narrative that you are committed to pushing, an agenda that you already have outlined, it no longer serves people like you and I. So that's where we make our own inroads. So Maurissa, it doesn't stop here. Congratulations to you for where you are. and where you are going. With
Thank
that, my
you.
people, that is hashtag my Be More. What's the 410? Maurissa
Thank
Stone
you.
or thebomb.com. Peace.
I just want you to be great. I just want you to be great. I just want you to be great. Even if it means you gotta leave me and you don't wanna be baby. Look, baby, I'm straight. I just want you to be great. I just want you to be great. I just want you to be great.